This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Saturday, so welcome back for another episode of the History of the Banned and Restricted List. In the first two parts of this series, we talked about the creation of the Banned and Restricted List in January 1994, and we've talked about the announcements through May of the same year. In this series, we look at the various cards that were put on and taken off of the list, and why these decisions were made. In this video, we're going to wrap up this first rather busy year of the Banned and Restricted List, 1994, by talking about announcements that came in the latter half of the year, namely in June, August, and October. So, as we've noted, the DCI was created to regulate tournament play in preparation for Wizards taking an active role in organizing and sanctioning tournaments, which would eventually culminate in the first Magic World Championship in August of 1994. We've seen them restricting and occasionally banning cards that were deemed too powerful, or perhaps not too good for the health of the game, like anti-cards and Shahrazad, and in large part, they were successful in making the game more enjoyable and less degenerate. However, there would still be two more banned and restricted announcements made before Worlds happened in August of 1994. The first of these came in June of 1994, and it only restricted a single card, MISHRA'S Workshop. Antiquities had been the second expansion after Arabian Nights, and while some cards from it had gotten restricted shortly after being printed, namely Candelabra of Tanos, Feldon's Cane, and Ivory Tower, MISHRA'S Workshop managed to make it through to June. A continuing theme we've seen in past announcements is that Wizards realized that they provided way too much fast mana at too low of a cost, hence cards like the Moxen, Black Lotus, and Soul Ring had been restricted way back in January. MISHRA'S Workshop also provided some obscene amounts of mana, though it was restricted to only being able to produce it for artifact spells. The fact that it was a land, meaning it didn't even cost any mana to play, meant you could net obscene amounts of mana with it. So, the workshop got restricted, and this took away one of the primary incentives for playing a bunch of artifacts, which in turn led to people to not taking advantage of playing only one workshop in Magic's earliest days. The workshop eventually got unrestricted in 1997 in Vintage, and it was pretty quiet for a while. But in more recent years, starting in 2011 especially, the workshop has seen heavy play in Vintage, even spawning an entire artifact-based deck called Ravager Shops. MISHRA'S Workshop has also been banned in Legacy since 2004, for the same reason it had been a concern back in 1994. So, MISHRA'S Workshop got restricted in June of 1994, but Wizards still managed to cram in one last announcement before Magic's first World Championship in August, and it was an announcement just a few weeks before the tournament. This was Wizards' last push to create an environment that was as healthy as possible for Worlds. This new announcement also came after Magic's third expansion, Legends, which had been released, and 5 of the cards that were restricted, and the one that got banned, were from this new set. With this announcement, 7 individual cards were added to the restricted list, and all Legends were also restricted. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but there was also one card that got banned, and that's where we're going to start, by looking at Divine Intervention. Divine Intervention is a lot like Shahrazad. It isn't an especially good card by any stretch, but it is absolutely terrible for the game. This incredibly costly 8-mana enchantment makes the game automatically end in a draw if it's allowed to stay in play. Like Shahrazad, this took games in directions that Wizards didn't really want them to go, and the whole idea that you were playing for a draw is something that they didn't like. They really didn't want people to run into this incredibly frustrating and uninteresting card as they were learning to play the game, and they didn't want people to be playing it at the highest level of competitive Magic, even in its fledgling state in 1994, so it got banned. In 1999, it got unbanned, and it of course hasn't gone on to be relevant anywhere, and by that point Wizards didn't really consider it a threat, and figured that if someone is dumping 8 mana into this thing in the Eternal formats, well, they're probably going to lose. Next, we'll talk about 2 cards that got restricted with this announcement, and for the same reason, so we're going to talk about them together, and those are Chaos Orb and Falling Star. Both of these cards seem quite strange to us today because they have an effect depending on how you throw the card and on what permanent it lands on, something we would only see these days in an unset. Chaos Orb is the more busted of the two, destroying anything it hits, while Falling Star just does 3 damage to creatures. While this was clearly something Wizards liked toying with in the early days of the game, it was around this time that they started to realize that such cards were problematic. One of the big problems is that the card isn't clear about what either player can do. Famously, there's a story involving a player ripping up his Chaos Orb and throwing it up in the air like confetti, nuking the entire board. Additionally, people would also try to move their cards out of the way while the orb was in the air, and people started to space their permanents in really extreme ways, making it as hard as possible to hit more than one permanent with Chaos Orb. Finally, it also asks users to have some sort of manual dexterity, a skill not asked for with any other cards, except Falling Star that also got restricted. Chaos Orb was legal as a one-of going into Worlds in 1994, and the top 4 decks all ran a singleton copy. However, all sorts of shenanigans involving the orb happened there. One of the top players asked the judge if it was true he could rip up his orb, and even ran 61 cards in his deck just in case he had to do it, and everyone played with their boards ludicrously spaced apart in order to avoid getting destroyed by the orb. Chaos Orb, along with Falling Star, would be upgraded to a ban in November of 1995, and they have remained on the ban list for Vintage ever since, showing that this type of dexterity card just shouldn't be part of the game in any format from the perspective of Wizards. Next, let's look at Mind Twist, which along with Chaos Orb were the only 2 cards in this announcement that weren't printed in Legends. Mind Twist is an incredibly strong card, and one that had managed to stay legal up until this point somehow. Lots of games came down to whoever cast Mind Twist first because they just destroyed their opponent's entire hand. This card was too swingy and too powerful, and Wizards wanted to at least make it so that people drew the card less frequently, so they restricted it. It would be played as a singleton copy in 3 of the top 4 decks at Worlds in 1994, and 1 at Worlds in 1995. As if you were playing black, there wasn't a good reason not to run the singleton copy. In early 1996, Mind Twist was actually banned completely as it was deemed too powerful. It got restored to restricted status in Vintage in 2000, and after seeing no play as a singleton copy in those days, it was fully unrestricted in June 2007. It hasn't gone on to do much after Magic's early days, but it seems like it was the right call to restrict it when they did. So next, let's look at Sword of the Ages. So far, we've talked about cards that were banned or restricted for reasons that are pretty obvious to us today, but now we move to the first head-scratcher of this particular announcement, and that is Sword of the Ages, which is one of those cards from Legends that got restricted. To us today, this would not be a card that would concern us at all. It's an expensive 6-mana artifact that comes into play tapped, and it comes with an activated ability where you can tap it and sacrifice any number of creatures to do damage to a creature or player equal to their combined power. Those creatures also get exiled to prevent too many shenanigans. Between being slow and demanding you have a considerable board presence, this doesn't seem like much. Still, Wizards was most concerned about what might happen if people used this in conjunction with cards like Ball Lightning or Berserk. However, this is one that Wizards would quickly realize wasn't as much of a concern as they thought, and it was quickly unrestricted in 1996 after not having seen play at all as a singleton copy while on the restricted list, and it hasn't gone on to do anything since being fully legal in the format. Next, we'll look at Recall, which is another card that I think we have a hard time understanding today. This is pretty expensive mana-wise and card-wise. For example, if you want 1 card back from your graveyard, you're going to end up having to pay 3 mana and discard a card to get that 1 card back. If you pay 5 mana total, you discard 2 cards and get 2 cards back, and at that point you're breaking even card-wise, but you're paying a ton of mana and giving up resources for this effect. I think how weak this is by today's standards is perhaps best illustrated by Wildest Dreams, a green version with a similar effect that doesn't require you to discard anything. However, when we really consider the context of Recall, it does make a bit more sense. In part 2 of this video series, we saw a lot of cards get restricted because they undermined the banned and restricted list, essentially giving a player opportunities to use the restricted cards more than once a game, which was what Wizards wanted to avoid. This resulted in cards like Feldon's Cane, Demonic Tutor, and the like getting restricted. Well, Recall is in the same boat. While it may not seem that efficient to us right now, if you're returning your Time Walk or Ancestral Recall or other obscenely powerful card, you're going to be feeling pretty great about what you're doing. A good way of illustrating how important context is for this card is to point out that the card remained restricted in Vintage all the way until 1999. But the card was unrestricted in Standard in 1996 because the Power 9 and the like weren't legal there. There just weren't as powerful of things that you could get back with Recall. Between 1994 and 1996, Recall saw play at Magic's highest levels, putting up great finishes there, but it hasn't done anything since then. Next, let's look at Mirror Universe, which I think is another odd restriction from our perspective today. This card lets you exchange life totals with your opponent, an effect at the time that was fairly unique and seemed really powerful, but as we know today, setting up these effects to really work well is hard to do. I mean, we recently had Access of Mortality printed, a card that can exchange life totals numerous times, and it wasn't good at all. Basically, if you exchange life totals when you're behind, it usually isn't going to make much of a difference, and generally, if you want to exchange life totals, well, it's because you're behind. If you're not dealing with whatever is making it so you're behind on board, you're still going to die no matter how much life you have. So in the long run, an effect like this isn't all that good, at least these days. However, a change to the rules with the printing of Revise stated that you don't lose the game immediately when you go to 0 life, only at the end of a phase. This meant you could combo Mirror Universe with cards like Lich and City of Brass to make yourself go to 0, and then exchange life with your opponent, who would die as soon as the phase ended. Wizards didn't like this combo. It was something they had mostly overlooked, though it does seem they made it so that you could only sacrifice it during your upkeep to maybe prevent combos, but they still didn't manage to stop it from happening. In an effort to reduce the number of 2-card instant win combos around, like they did by restricting Channel earlier in the year, they also restricted Mirror Universe. The big difference here, though, is that Mirror Universe ended up not really being a threat at all, and I think is a largely forgotten card. It would be unrestricted in 1999, and it never went on to do anything at the highest level of competitive play. The last individual card to be restricted by the August announcement was Underworld Dreams, a card that has been reprinted a bunch, so one I think most people are familiar with. And it isn't like it's seen play off of those reprints. It's never been really an especially relevant tournament card. The concern seems to have been at the time that it was especially effective with cards like Wheel of Fortune, Brain Geyser, and Time Twister, which force you and the opponent to draw a bunch of cards, but those cards were restricted. Underworld Dreams wasn't played as a singleton copy while it was restricted, and it would go on to not really see play at all after being unrestricted in 1999, despite being reprinted in a bunch of standard legal sets. In addition to all of these individual cards being restricted, an entire new group of cards was restricted, and these were Legends, which debuted, of course, in the set Legends. What we call now today the Legendary Super type was just Legend at the time. The Legend rule is one of the ones in Magic that has undergone the most change over time, and it alone would probably make a pretty interesting video. But the point here is, when Legends originally debuted, it was decided that because they were meant to represent unique individuals or locations or items, that people could only play a single copy in their whole deck. In other words, all legendary permanents were restricted. This kind of makes sense in terms of flavor, but in the long run didn't last much more than a year, and starting in 1995 and ever since then, you can play up to 4 copies of any legend in your deck, unless of course it happens to be restricted. Alright, so that moves us to the final banned and restricted announcement of 1994, which came in October of that year. By this time, another new expansion had been released, The Dark. This announcement restricted a single card from that set, Maze of Ith. Maze of Ith has a pretty powerful effect, being capable of essentially shutting down your opponent's best attacker every turn. The Maze is one of those lands that doesn't produce mana, something that was pretty common back then, but Wizards was apparently pretty concerned about this land, enough that it was restricted less than 2 months after being printed. The fact that it could be played in any deck, thanks to just being a land, had Wizards worried everyone would just be packing a ton of these and make games incredibly long and boring. However, Maze of Ith wasn't played as a singleton copy at all, and it would be unrestricted in 1997, and didn't do much until more recently in Magic history, where it became a regularly played card in Legacy, especially in the Lands deck, which, as you might have guessed, is a deck that runs a bunch of lands and ways to tutor them up, and finding the Maze when you really need it can be pretty nice there. So maybe all along it was right to restrict it in those days, as it has certainly gone on to considerably more success recently. Well, that does it for this episode of the History of the Banned and Restricted List. 1994 was a really busy year, and it took us 3 videos and more than half an hour to get through all of those announcements. 1995 would end up being much quieter, and we'll be able to cover the whole year in the next episode of this series. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to go back and watch the earlier episodes, the playlist should be on your screen now. Thanks for watching.